Welcome one, welcome all to this, the fifth in the series of global webinars to be held this year under the auspices of the London Shipping Law Centre. My name is Jeremy Thomas. I'm an honorary director of the LSLC, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to this evening seminar, which is being hosted by 20 Essex Court Chambers. The subject matter for discussion is cyber fraud and cyber piracy, and we're fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts who will enlighten us on the various aspects of the problems that can arise and hopefully how they can be avoided or at the very least mitigated. But first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our chairman for this evening, Sir Bernard Ricks, who I feel sure will already be known to many of you. Sir Bernard was a doyen of the commercial bar for many years, gaining an unrivaled reputation. He was known for his conscientious and meticulous preparation of cases. I was informed by his then clerk, Tom Byrne, that Sir Bernard liked to start early of a morning and once complained that he was unable to get into chambers at 3 Essex Court in the Temple before 6:30 a.m. I understand he was one of the youngest barristers to take silk, and he was then in due course elevated to the bench in 1993, serving in the Court of Appeal in due course for some 13 years before retiring in 2013. He now sits as an arbitrator and mediator and is an international judge of the Singapore Court and a member of the Cayman Islands Court of Appeal. Ladies and gentlemen, your chairman, Sir Bernard Ricks.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that kind introduction. I'm sure, like everyone else at the commercial bar, we have got into chambers at times long before 6:30. At any rate, it's a great pleasure to be chairing a session again of the LSLC, which takes me back to my shipping roots. We have a very expert tribunal of speakers, panel of speakers this evening to speak on a very modern subject. So it's quite flattering to me to be involved in so modern a subject as cyber fraud and cyber piracy. To introduce your speakers in the order in which they're going to speak, let me first mention Robert Hodge, who is the director of the International Transport Intermediaries Club, which ensures across the world most of the intermediaries, the shipbrokers, the ship agents, and the ship managers. And is part of Thomas Miller. Robert started life with P&O. He then went to the super yacht world, and now he's in insurance. And he is going to speak from the point of view of an underwriter about the role that negligence plays in cyber fraud and how insurance can perhaps help even the negligent. I'm not sure if I've spoken correctly there. Our next speaker is Matthew Mcgee from 20 Essex. He's been described as a rising star in shipping by the Legal 500. But of particular relevance is the fact that he is the author already of a book, Practical Guide to Cyber Fraud Litigation. He enjoys working by himself as an advocate, but also being part of a team in large and complex commercial disputes. And Matthew is going to ask, being a court advocate, who you can hold liable when things go wrong. And our third speaker is Thomas Stewart, of another barrister of 36 stone, And he is also an author or a co-author of a work about the modern world of technology. The book is called Cyber Risks and Insurance, the Legal Principles. And he has good experience of cyber disputes covering invoice frauds, phishing attacks on companies, and cyber attacks on vessels. Each of our speakers is going to speak for about 15 to 18 minutes. I'm a ruthless timekeeper. I shall hit my glass at 15 minutes, hit it again at 18 minutes, and expect that to be a sign of termination or redelivery. Because we hope to have time for your questions, please. So please sharpen your pencils, get ready your questions for our panel. And with that introduction, and without any more ado, let me ask Robert to start. Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Bernard, and thank you very much to the LSLC for inviting me to talk today. It's a great honour. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a underwriter, so I'm going to come at this from a underwriting and practical side. ITIC, for those who don't know, is a professional indemnity insurer to the transport sector. So we insure marine, rail, aviation, but many of you here today will know us for insuring all the ship managers, ship agents, ship brokers around the world for the likes of Clarksons, Maersk Broker, BRS, V-Ships, Wilhelmsen, and GAC. And they are all members and board directors. So as you can understand, we're a mutual provider of this insurance. And we're managed by Thomas Miller. So you may know the UK P&I Club, the Food Transport Club, and for the barristers in the room, we also manage the Bar Mutual. So we also provide your insurance, so please be careful. So my talk today, it is going to be focusing on email fraud or man-in-the-middle fraud. It could be called business email compromise. It all has similar names for the same type of loss. And I'm an expert, but unfortunately I've become an expert in this because we're paying so many claims. We've paid nearly $5 million in these type of losses in recent years, and it's a growing trend. Now you may be wondering why a professional indemnity insurer is discussing cyber-related matters. Well, actually, we don't see these as cyber as such. They all revolve around negligent performance of the insured service, whether that is a negligence in shipbroking or ship agency or ship management. In any event, it all leads to a loss to the principal. Now, so Bernard was saying this is a very new area. Well, it is new in the way it's done, but crime and fraud within the shipping world is very old, as old as shipping probably, whether it's bill of lading fraud or telex fraud. This is just a new way of defrauding the parties within the transaction of shipping. Unfortunately, no, it's rife. So my talk is going to be giving some background to it and then some loss prevention advice. And when I was saying negligence, IBM has actually done a study into the root causes of cyber breaches, and they suggest that 95% of cyber breaches are actually caused by human error. So in other words, 19 out of 20 of these cyber breaches arise from a mistake. Now, how is it done? So I'll give you a background, the basic makeup of an attack. And I've spoken to IT experts, cyber experts, and they say pretty much the same pattern happens every time. You'll get a phishing email, and then a spoofing email, and then a payment to a third party, a fraudulent third party. Now, what do I mean by a phishing email? Well, a phishing email is an email that's been sent into you in an attempt for you to click on a link within that email, or maybe open an attachment within that email. Once you've clicked on that link or opened that email, that attachment, malware will be placed upon your computer network or your server. And once that's happened, the hackers are within your system. So that's the basic phishing attempt. There is also what is known as spear phishing. Now, spear phishing is where you have a targeted attack. And where I say a targeted attack, it is that the fraudsters will research a company, maybe looking at LinkedIn. They'll look at your company profile. They'll see who the right person within the company is to specifically target their email. And this is not your sort of typical teenager sitting in his bedroom on his laptop. These are organized crime units who act as if the whole transaction is a business. So they have a hierarchy of roles, one person doing the research, another setting up a fraudulent account, another within the group having a computer expert to set up a hacking attempt. So it's very sophisticated. And once they've identified the party within the company, they'll send a targeted email to that person, hoping that they'll click on the link. Now, I highly recommend a current BBC podcast called The Lazarus Heist. The Lazarus Heist is all about a North Korean hacking group which went on to famously set up ransomware attack on Sony Pictures when they were producing the film The Interview, which was all about the assassination of Kim Jong-un. And then further to that, audaciously, they stole $1 billion from the Bangladesh National Bank, diverting it to a Philippine bank. Unfortunately, they only got away with 100 million because it was stopped at the last minute. But the important point is it all began with a phishing attempt. They sent an email into the HR department of the Bangladesh bank asking for a job application, and they asked the HR department to click on the link to get to their CV. The HR department clicked on the link, opened up the CV, and malware was placed on the Bangladesh bank's network. And once they were in, they took a number of months to move their way through the system and finally reached the SWIFT terminal where they could then hack it and move $1 billion. So it is remarkable how this happened. And the first piece of loss prevention advice that I can give you is never, ever click on links in emails or open attachments to an email you're unsure of the source of. So, because if you do, you will very likely have malware placed on your system. So once the hackers have gained access to the system, what will they do then? Well, they'll sit in your email server and they'll monitor the flow of traffic. They could take several weeks to do this. They'll learn the language of the trade. So I've seen emails of these type of events, hacks, where you look at the email and it looks like it's been written by a shipbroker. And as you know, shipbroker language is highly abbreviated and quite technical, but this pretty much mirrored the shipbroking language, and it was almost impossible to identify. So they'll sit in your email server, monitoring the flow of communication, and the trigger for them is when they see an email coming from a supplier, maybe a bunker supplier or an owner requesting a payment of hire, and at that point they'll go off and set up a spoofed email address. And what do I mean by spoof? Well, spoofing is where you set up something to look like another. That can be an email, it could be a Wi-Fi network. So if you go to a cafe and you log into the Wi-Fi network, you should be very careful to be sure it's the actual cafe's Wi-Fi, because hackers will maybe sitting at two tables near to you, broadcasting their own network, hoping that you'll log into their fake network to put in your credentials. It could also be, you can also spoof mobile numbers now and telephone numbers. So if you get a text or a phone call, you may not be sure the actual source of that phone call. And I know Thomas will be talking about spoofing of GPS signals. You can also spoof GPS signals. So they'll set up a very similar email address, maybe changing a letter within that email address, an I to an L, and they'll send an email with a new invoice asking for payment. And often, unfortunately, that is enough to fool the payer into paying that invoice. Now, you may think, actually, all you need to do is really study the email address to make sure it's the right spelling. So see if there's any issues with the actual email address itself. Well, that's not enough nowadays, because the hackers can use software where they can send an email looking like any email in the world. So you can receive something from Thomas Miller, and you can't be generally sure it's actually come from us, because even if you reply to that message, it will have the genuine email address. Although importantly, if you do reply to that email, it will go to the owner of the email address, but half the battle is won. If the fraudsters have put in fake bank account details into that message, it looks very plausible and you may pay against it. So you can't trust any new bank account details you receive over email. Even if you are a technical expert and you can interrogate the header, they're very difficult to review. Also, once a hacker's within the email server, they will set up protocols. So they can set up protocols to delete emails coming from a certain party or even block. So what we see in these type of frauds is on one side they're sending messages asking for payment. On the other side, they're sending messages stating, don't worry, the money's on its way, and basically to slow down the parties realizing they're being hacked. It's all very clever. And they'll also try to spoof both sides. So they'll set up one spoofed email for the shipbroker, another spoofed email for the charterer, and they'll play each other off. So I'll give you some claims examples of things that we've actually seen recently, and these are just a few of the many that we receive. And as I say, $5 million in claims and rising. For example, a shipbroker was communicating with the owner, talking about the bank account details they would like payment to. They verified those bank account details by phoning the owner. They confirmed the bank details were correct. But just as the hire was about to be paid, shipbroker received a final email from the owner saying, oh, sorry, we just realized we sent you the wrong bank account details, new bank account details attached. And they didn't check them, they paid. But often this happens on a Friday afternoon. And on a Friday afternoon, things are rushed. The hackers, the fraudsters will pretend, put pressure on the shipbroker, quickly pay. But more, you can pretty guarantee if you're under pressure when you're making these payments, you're going to be defrauded. And in that case, we paid $360,000. We don't just see shipbroking in this type of losses. For example, ship agency. In one case, we had a ship agent was asked to send $100,000 to cash to master to the load port agent. The owner put the agent into funds, and after that, the vessel wasn't going to call at that particular port. So it was a change of vessel orders. The owner requested the return of those funds. It was the email requesting the return of the funds that had been hacked. So the agent sent the money back to a fraudster, a loss of $100,000. Again, there was a change in an email address. It's not just the payment of funds that we see where the payer is hacked. You can also see it when you just pass on information. So we paid a $500,000 where shipbrokers don't often like to reveal the contact details of their counterparties. So in this case, they just cut and pasted the bank account details from the owner's email into their email to forward onto the charterer. Obviously, the charterer can only rely upon the information provided by the shipbroker, and they pay. However, this was a couple of years ago, and this fraud is so well known nowadays. ITIC is banging the drum, giving loss prevention advice. The P&I clubs are providing loss prevention advice on this very issue. We now argue, actually, even if there's been some liability from the shipbroker, the real culpability is in the hands of the party paying and not checking bank account details when you're paying, if they're new, I believe is truly a negligent act, because we all should be knowing about this and checking. And then finally, the fraudsters will know, for example, talking about the Lazarus Heist, that was complicated by the hackers knowing that in the Philippines there was a national holiday, so it slowed down the entire process. So we had one claim where a shipbroker received fake bank account details, and the hacker advised that their bank account was closed due to auditing reasons. The charterer was somewhat suspicious, so they asked the broker, well, we want an addendum to the charter party with these bank account details in the CP. The broker said fine. They attached the bank account details to the CP and then sent them off to the owner and chartering copy. Unfortunately, the owner's office was closed as there's a national holiday in their country, and it wasn't until the Tuesday when it was picked up. By that time, the hire had gone off to the fraudulent account. So those are some very basic claims, and you can see they are real clangers, and I've just been clanged, so I shall speed up to my final points. But they are obviously fairly simple frauds, but it's amazing how often it happens, because if you're dealing with invoicing and emails on a daily basis, it's quite easy to miss the odd change in email address in the header of the email. So we suggest the only real way to combat this is to, when you get new bank account details from a counterparty you've never paid before, is just to take the time to pick up the phone and verify those bank account details with the counterparty. Even if it takes a few days extra, it's worth the time, because you can bet the one time you don't verify those bank account details, you will be defrauded. In fact, we had a shipbroker who was received fraud bank account details. Well, they've received an email with the bank account details, and soon later, I think an hour later, they had a call from someone and saying, oh, by the way, those bank account details you just received from us, I just want to reassure you they're 100% genuine. And the shipbroker relied upon that phone call and paid against them. So he got caught out. So we suggest don't phone the number in the email, because you'll be speaking to the fraudster. Don't email the fraudster asking you, just confirm that they're correct. Phone someone you can trust. So it's very basic and very simple. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Phone someone you can trust. That's a good way to end. All right, over to Matt.
Thank you, Sir Bernard, and I'll just add my thanks as well to the LSLC for inviting me to speak, but also to all of you for coming to along to listen on a Monday afternoon. I'm going to spend my time cantering through effectively the options which are available to parties where one or other of them have not followed Robert's salutary advice, with the result that a fraudster has managed to abscond with, we're going to take the example of charter payments just to make it straightforward. Now, again, as Robert indicated early on, there is no sort of new magic to this. An American jurist has previously said, there is no more law of cyberspace than there is a law of the horse. And what we're actually dealing with is just very well-established ideas of contracts and tort, and just applying them to a new environment of email fraud and the various more sophisticated methods which are increasingly coming about, as Robert touched on. So I'm going to be touching on a couple of older authorities, how they apply in a new context, and also referring to a couple of new cases where these sorts of issues are starting to be teased out. And all of the cases I do mention are on a handout, which I believe is going to be circulated at the end of this webinar. So those will be there as a written record. I'm going to launch straight in to the scenario that Robert started out at with, and that's hire being misdirected from a charterer and being sent to a fraudster rather than the owner that the charterer thought they were paying. Ultimately here, the owner and the charterer are going to be almost inevitably having an argument about which one of them ends up bearing the loss of the fraud, and one of them who walks away with the loss might then try and shift it on elsewhere. I'm going to spend most of my time dealing with the first issue as between the two parties, and just at the very end look at a couple of other options. Now, the starting point unsurprisingly, is to look at what the obligation is as between the parties, what the payment obligation is. It might seem relatively straightforward at a point that might not be your first thought in these sorts of cases, but it is worth checking, although you are unlikely to very much help in the contract. There was a recent case on this called K and A, where precisely this point was considered where there had been a fraud. And there the court held that generally, unless there's something more specific in the contract, the charterer must give the owner the unconditional and unfettered right to the immediate use of the funds. Now, plainly, if the funds are in a fraudster's bank account rather than the owner's bank account, that's simply not met. So the charterer has not met their obligation under the charter. They still have the debt to pay. How can they try and effectively shift that onto the owner's plate? Well, the first route which is normally tried is to rely on agency in some way, because even though the payment obligation has not been met, the charterer might try and argue that they paid according to the instructions of an agent, and that payment in accordance with an agent's instructions is good payment of a debt, and therefore owners are no longer entitled to look for payment from when you're thinking about a fraudster who's not conventionally going to be the charterer, the agent of an owner. But let's just take a obvious, albeit slightly unlikely example to start with, and that's where the fraudster may in fact be an employee of the owners. Now, in that case, if the employee is the fraudster, they're going to almost certainly be acting outside of their actual authority, but they may nevertheless be within their ostensible or apparent authority. And apparent authority is in the classic case of Freeman and Lockyer. The question there arises, well, did owners in some way represent, by conduct or by their words, that the individual concerned had authority to act as owner's agent? Now, if you have an employee whose purpose in the communication is to provide payment details, and they provide false payment details, unsurprisingly, perhaps the charter is going to have quite a strong case to say, well, yes, I paid in accordance with your agent. Yes, they may have gone off on a product of their own, but I didn't know that, and therefore I have discharged my debt. Now, that is perhaps the unlikely way this works. As Robert indicated, normally you're talking about a fraudster who's coming from outside. They're not connected to the parties. They are doing this effectively as a criminal business. And there we have to start to think about how exactly has the fraudster got involved, and how are they perpetrating this fraud? These are the sorts of arguments that parties quite often get tied up in, but in my experience, they don't always get tied up in looking at precisely the right questions. The starting point is that we do need to be very careful in distinguishing between the individuals who are perpetrating the fraud and the email addresses that they're using to do it. Put very, very simply, an email address is not a legal person. An email address cannot be an agent. So when we're looking at this question about whether there's been the discharge of a debt, we're looking at the circumstances when a fraudster can be the agent of the owner. So we're not too concerned about the email address at the starting point. The reason why this is important is because some of these frauds are perpetrated by the fraudster taking over the genuine email account used by owners. And there you do have some quite understandably aggrieved charterers saying, well, we followed Robert's advice, we checked the email address very, very carefully, and it was definitely the one that we've always been using. Nevertheless, there is a case, which admittedly is only an unreported one from the county court, which has held that even where you have a genuine email address taken over in this way, the, I suppose, classic analysis is correct, that the fraudster is the person behind the email address. The fraudster is the person you're saying, are they or are they not an agent? And the answer to that is plainly no. It doesn't matter that it's the genuine email address that's been taken over. Now, that said, there is a very small window of opportunity here, and that was mentioned in this county court case of J. Brazil Road, which, as I say, is on my handout. And there, the court said, well, if the person who did have the email address had in some way represented that the emails were secure, that there was a very high level of password protection or other security on the email account, then that might constitute an implicit representation that effectively the only person who could have access to that address is a person who is authorized to have access to that address. Now, that is the way in which you'd have to navigate as the charterer to try and effectively make good your case that you have discharged the debt here. It's a pretty tricky route to run, and one that I suspect would be quite unlikely in the shipping context, simply because certainly from my experience, I wouldn't imagine an owner deciding to step forward and tell their counterparty that actually they are effectively taking on this obligation of saying, yes, I have a secure messaging set up and I'm going to effectively undertake additional duties on that basis. I touched there on duties, and that brings me on to my sort of final point for the charterer to try and take in their argument as to why owners should be bearing the risk of this loss. And this involves charterers actually going on the offensive and saying, well, I say the way in which the fraudster got involved with this particular case is that they compromised owners' email servers, or owners did something stupid. They left some documents unattended, or in some way allowed the details of the charter to be got out into the public and accessed by a fraudster. And because effectively the owners are the root cause of the fraud taking place, or the opportunity for the fraud to take place, owners are now responsible for the consequences. The difficulty here is that it involves creating quite an unusual and onerous duty on owners merely by the fact that the two parties are dealing with one another. There are two cases where this sort of argument about cybersecurity has come up in the last couple of years. They're called Sell Your Car With Us and Riksmuseum Twent, and apologies for the pronunciation for any linguists in the room. But in both of those cases, there were attempts to say that there was some implicit representation. Apologies, I'm told that my audio is not very good. I do apologize about that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off the video in the hope that that helps the bandwidth. So hopefully this is a little bit clearer now. I was saying about these two recent cases where there has been a discussion about owners giving implicit representations about effectively what duties there may be. Certainly the parties in the position of charterers in these two cases tried to argue that there were implicit extra contractual representations, or even that there was an implied contractual duty where the party in owner's position had to effectively take reasonable care to maintain cybersecurity. The problem with those sorts of arguments is that it's very difficult to imply those sorts of duties. Unsurprisingly, to be an implied term of the charter, it must be necessary. That's a very high hurdle, and to the extent that it's tempted to put that obligation in tort, that is a claim for a pure economic loss, and therefore there needs to be a voluntary assumption of responsibility on the part of the owner over the cybersecurity, and a voluntary assumption of responsibility to the charterer themselves. So those are very, very high bars for a charterer to show in any given case. So I suppose just taking a step back and looking at that as a whole, what I'm saying is where a charterer pays according to a fraudster's instructions, even if the fraudster's instructions have come from the owner's genuine email address, I do see it as a very difficult argument for charterers to say that they nevertheless do not have to pay again. So it's charterers looking at bearing the loss. Now, so far I've been talking about the position just directly between owners and charterers, but obviously in the shipping context, you'll normally have a broker involved. And Robert mentioned a few different cases where actually the brokers have been the ones targeted by the fraudsters who've been passing on the fraudulent messages. So what difference does it make where you do have a broker? Well, that then depends on exactly what sort of broker you have. To the extent that you just have each party having their own broker, that own broker is treated exactly like the party, their principal. So if charterer's broker is contacted by the fraudster, it's exactly the same as if the fraudster had contacted charterers directly. Equally, if the fraudster has contacted owner's broker, pretending to be owner, and then owner's broker has passed the message on to charterers, well, in that case, actually, yes, you do have a genuine agent of owners passing on incorrect bank details. So that would be the case where charterers could say, yes, I've discharged the debt by paying in accordance with your agent's instructions. Otherwise, I suppose, other most likely situation on the broker side of things would be where you have a pure intermediary just sitting, passing messages between the two parties, not acting for one or other of them. Now, the position of pure intermediaries has been discussed recently in two cases, CH Offshore and SK Shipping. And in both of them, the judges upheld what really is widely understood, which is that an intermediary has no real agency function. They're effectively just a postbox. So in that case, and here we might have a lot of sympathy with charterers, if the intermediary is fooled by the fraudster and passes on a message to charterers, that intermediary has no agency function for owners, and therefore charterers, if they pay in accordance with those instructions, are going to have to pay again. So it does, I suppose, really reiterate Robert's point about check, check, and check again. But say charterers have paid, they can't argue it as against owners that actually charterers try and recover their misdirected payment from somebody else. I'm going to deal with three targets very quickly because I'm conscious of time and that you want to listen to Tom talking about piracy. The first option is going as against the broker. And here it will very much depend on the precise relationship between the charterer and the broker, whether they're a sole party broker or perhaps a pure intermediary. And really, I suppose this comes to what Robert was talking about, which is the relationship as between the broker and the charterer. Can the charterer say that under a contract or by some other means, the broker owed them a duty to take care to guard against this sort of fraud, because charterers are obviously very exposed to it. So that will be an issue to be considered, and potentially there could be recovery as against the broker. Another option, a very unusual one perhaps in this context, would be to go as against the banks in the banking chain. Now, this could easily be its own talk. It's a very hot topic at the moment. There's two different options here. The first is that charterers could look to their own bank, the paying bank, and effectively say that the paying bank ought to have stopped the payment out, that it was obviously a fraud, and that it was a breach of the quince care duty, which has received a bit of attention in a couple of recent cases. That, I think, would be very difficult in this sort of circumstance, but it's something that could be explored in the right case. The other option is to actually look at the fraudster's receiving bank. Now, this is a particularly live issue, and there are several cases, both recent cases and also some going on at the moment, where these sorts of issues are being discussed. One option is to say that the receiving bank has been unjustly enriched by receiving the stolen money, effectively. And there are two cases that I've put on the handout which say whether or not the bank has been enriched in this way is a sufficiently open question that it's not actually capable of summary judgment. So that there's an interesting area there for future development. The other option is to say that the bank is in some way dishonestly, and I hear the chime, I'm very nearly done. And that is a tricky argument, that there are two cases I've mentioned on the slide where that sort of argument is being run, but you do really need to show some sort of knowledge on the part of the bank. I'm going to make my one final point and then pass over to Sir Bernard. The final option is to go against the fraudsters themselves. Now, this is really a commercial decision because it could well be throwing good money after bad. There have been recent cases where the courts have been very keen to enable action as against fraudsters, but there is a lot of uncertainty about recoverability because you may not ever find them. thank you very much for your attention on this whistle-stop tour. I'd love to talk to anyone about experiences they've got or questions they've got in the Q&A. So please do add those to the function. Otherwise, on the handout, I have put a bit of a general rule of thumb at the end by way of conclusion, who unfortunately, without wanting to do any lawyers out of a job, every case turns on its own facts. Thank you very much. Thank
you, Matt. Thank you very much. And a reminder to our audience, please, to get your questions in. And now, Thomas, I forgot to mention when introducing Thomas what his subject was, but it is the vulnerability of vessels, including autonomous vessels, to cyber attack. Thomas.
Thank you, Sir Bernard. I'm very grateful for that introduction. And may I also add my thanks to the LSLC and to everyone who's tuned in on a cold and wet Monday afternoon. The first question that I need to answer is, what do I mean by cyber-piracy? Well, in its most basic sense, it covers piracy in the sense of attacks on ships or ports. When people mention piracy, it might evoke images of Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean or Tom Hanks in Captain Phillips. Cyber fraud is rather less glamorous and tends to be more invisible. As with cyber fraud more generally, the perpetrators are often anonymous. They may be criminal gangs, hostile states, disgruntled former employees, or even bored teenagers sitting in their bedrooms at home. And this all makes it a difficult area in terms of identifying the risks and the possible avenues of protection. Attacks are instead often known merely by the nickname given to the particular worm or virus that infects a system. Perhaps the worst example in recent years comes from June 2017, when the NotPetya ransomware virus struck across the IT systems of Maersk. Although backup systems meant that operations were not brought to a complete standstill, it did cause severe disruption as tens of thousands of computers were rendered unusable. And in total, it is estimated to have cost around $300 million. In September last year, CMA CGM was hit by the Ragnar Locker ransomware. Lloyd's List reported that the hacker requested the French carrier to contact it within 2 days via live chat and pay for the special decryption key. And to date, as far as I'm aware, the identity of the perpetrators is still not known. Cyber-piracy is also more difficult to pin down because the motivations of the attacks may be widely varied. Ransomware is an obvious example of an attack intended for financial gain, but hackers may also be motivated by a desire to steal data or trade secrets, or simply to cause disruption. In October 2013, the BBC reported on an attack on the port of Antwerp by drug smugglers, which is believed to have taken place over a 2-year period from 2011. Hackers breached the IT systems which controlled the movement and location of containers at the port, and they were then able to hide cocaine and heroin in containers among legitimate cargoes before changing the location and delivery time to allow their own drivers to intercept the drugs at discharge port. There are also risks in terms of potential property damage, the imposition of fines by regulators, or reputational damages. But the consequences can be far worse and can also extend to risks to human life. A cyber attack can, for example, render a ship completely incapable of moving. And it is not hard to see that if a crew loses control of a ship, the risk of grounding, for example, could endanger the crew, the cargo, and the vessel. In 2014, for example, Reuters reported a case of hackers who shut down a floating oil platform by tilting it. Spoofing is also becoming increasingly common, as evidenced by the recent case of the Stena Impero, which drifted into Iranian waters, apparently because of a spoofing attack, thereby placing the vessel and her crew at the risk of detention by local authorities. Shipping and trade is particularly vulnerable to such attacks for a multitude of reasons: financial value of the industry, the importance of smooth trade to everyday life. But it's also vulnerable because of the multiple possible entry points for an attack. Ships have on board a variety of computers, and any connection to the internet opens them up to the vulnerability through the so-called Internet of Things. I'm sure many in the audience will have read scare stories about how hackers might be able to take control of someone's personal computer by gaining access through their smart fridge, though few hackers would probably want to do that. But the principle remains the same, and the same techniques can be used to gain entry into the vessel's onboard systems, perhaps to take over control of a vessel or to install ransomware or other malware. On board a vessel, there will be crew who might have personal devices all connected to the ship's Wi-Fi, and it is not uncommon for USB sticks to be taken on board containing information that could be infected in advance with malware, which could then in turn infect the vessel's onboard computers. Another factor is social engineering. Impersonating trusted institutions such as governments or banks is a common way of persuading people to part with sensitive information such as bank details, and employees of ship owners and operators are in theory no less vulnerable than any other members of society. In light of these ever-growing risks, the industry has not been slow to respond. The risk of cyber piracy to shipping and trade has been on the radar for some years now, and countries have been hard at work in developing appropriate responses. The European Union Agency for Cyber Security published its ENISA guidelines in 2011, for example. The US Coast Guard published its cyber strategy in June 2015, underlining the threat of cyber attacks to the nation's maritime transportation system and critical infrastructure, and noting that in the US alone, there are approximately 360 sea and river ports handling more than $1.3 trillion in annual cargo. BIMCO has issued its own guidelines on cybersecurity on board ships. That was first issued in 2016. I believe the most recent version is version 4, issued last year. In 2018, the Tramo Deepling was the first vessel to be certified cyber safe by Lloyd's Register. Perhaps the most important development at the moment is IMO Resolution 428-98. In light of the growing threat to the shipping industry, in June 2017, the IMO published Resolution MSC 428-98, along with guidelines on maritime cyber risk management, MSC FAL1 Circular 3. The resolution provides that a safety management system should take into account cyber risk management in accordance with the objectives and functional requirements of the ISM code. However, some commentators, including HFW, have noted that the resolution is not prescriptive and that owing to the ambiguity of the resolution and the guidelines, there may well be wide variety in the way that the guidelines are implemented by various flag states. Where does all of this leave those involved in the industry? Well, in the contractual environment, parties can, of course, allocate risks to each other to a certain extent. BIMCO, for example, has developed the Cyber Security Clause 2019, which can be used in charter parties or bill of lading contracts, and which was developed by Clave Ness, Thomas Miller Navigate, and HFW. This has 4 aspects. The first subclause covers the requirement to ensure cyber health. The second imposes responsibility on parties for any third-party providers of cybersecurity, which is an important point that I'll come back to in due course. The third clause is a notification requirement in recognition of the speed at which these attacks can happen, and what I described above as the invisible nature of attacks. And the fourth aspect is a limitation of liability with a default cap of $100,000. The obligation on the parties is to implement appropriate cybersecurity measures and to use reasonable endeavours. Clearly, it's not going to be possible to give a blanket definition of what will meet these needs. And as with all aspects, each case will depend on its facts. That's not a criticism of the clause, which is otherwise very clearly drafted and practical. Rather, it's a reflection of the fact that with the huge range of potential attacks and the differing requirements of any given trade, it isn't possible to draw up a firm clause that assists in every case. Another important consideration, both in the context of private contractual relationships, but also in the insurance context, is seaworthiness. The general test will be well known. Would a prudent owner have required that the defect be made good before sending their ship to sea, had they known of it? Seaworthiness will also extend to the systems installed on board a ship to ensure the ship can safely undertake the voyage. And if a system is defective, if it does not ensure that there is proper inspection, monitoring and repair of the damage. See, for example, the Toledo. In that regard, the role of the designated person ashore, the DPA, will likely take on a new importance. Clearly, if a ship is vulnerable to a cyber attack, it is potentially unseaworthy. But where is the line drawn? Note the comments in the Fjord Wind from 2000 to Lloyd's Rep 191. A ship should not be unseaworthy if proper care is taken. Or the test in the Eurasian Dream 2002. Seaworthiness must be judged by the standards and practices of the industry at the relevant time, at least so long as those standards and practices are reasonable. On the one hand, there are obvious examples which will not satisfy the obligation of seaworthiness, or even the lower standard of exercising due diligence to make a ship seaworthy. If, for example, the vessel's systems are protected by a simple and easily guessable password, such as ship1, that is likely to render a ship unseaworthy. It is also unlikely to be an excuse if a ship owner does not have antiviral software, or if it fails to update its software to an operating system or a patch identified to cover existing vulnerabilities. More difficult is what happens where a ship owner relies on software from a third-party provider. On the one hand, the obligation of seaworthiness is non-delegable, but does that mean that a ship owner would be expected to have its own IT experts to verify the code prepared by an internationally recognized antivirus software provider? It is, on the other hand, the ship owner and operator who has particular knowledge of the vessels and the nature of the trade that the vessels will be employed in, and therefore the risks that the trade is particularly vulnerable to. A ship traveling past North Korea, for example, might be more susceptible to a spoofing attack than one sailing in the Mediterranean. Certainly, ship owners should check that their SMS is adequate. They should also check that hardware and software is up to date. And the focus may shift. As well as scheduled dry docks and maintenance programs, ship owners and operators may need to consider having their own IT experts who can verify and, just as importantly, document the cyber health of a vessel. These sorts of questions will, of course, be ever changing as technology develops and as the dependence of ships on technology continues to increase. In the meantime, perhaps the best guidance that can be given is for ship owners and operators to stay aware as much as possible of the developing landscape. There is a wealth of guidance and regulation and articles that can be found, and parties should make sure that they keep abreast of the developing ways in which attacks can happen and in which precautions can be taken to guard against them. Finally, there is, thankfully, perhaps less risk to human life posed by cyber piracy than by traditional piracy, because the targets for ransom tend to be data rather than individuals. That's not always the case, but as a general indicator, it seems to be true. Different considerations will arise, however, when looking at the payment of a ransom to secure the release of hostages, as opposed to payment of a ransom to secure the release of data. In Macefield and Amlin, the Court of Appeal concluded that payment of a ransom is not lawful and was not per se against public policy, because there was no universal morality against the payment of ransom. The act not of the aggressor but of the victim of piratical threats performed in order to save property and the liberty or life of hostages. But it remains an open question whether similar public policy principles might apply, where the hostage was something such as data or financial information rather than the people's lives themselves. I wanted to talk a little bit about autonomous ships, although I'm conscious of the time. What I do want to do is just flag the development of the auto ship man, which is something that I know Robert has been involved in and something that I discussed with him before this talk. With the rise of autonomous ships, the dependence on technology is in turn, of course, going to increase, and the vulnerability of ships to cyber attacks will inevitably increase. One of the key considerations is that instead of having a master on board the ship, there will be somebody operating the ship on dry land. And one of the important aspects of the auto shipman, as I understand it, is going to be to try and ensure that the liability regime remains the same between owners and managers, even though the master, in inverted commas, will be conducting operations on dry land rather than on the vessel itself. I think Robert will be able to say when that draft is likely to be released, although I understand it's not published yet. In light of the time considerations, I think I will end it there. But may I express my thanks to the LSLC for inviting me to give this talk, and may I reiterate that if anybody has questions, they should of course feel free to enter them in the Q&A. And likewise, if anyone wants to send me an email personally afterwards, I'd be more than happy to consider any questions that arise.
Thank you very much, Thomas. May I commend all the speakers for their complete timeliness in their presentations. Thank you very much indeed. So we have some questions, and I will put them to the panel in the order in which they've arrived in my Q&A box. So the first is from Nicola Cox, who asks, is there any recourse against the fraudsters or the recipient's bank, either in tort and or for breach of a relevant banking legislation, for the bank not having performed its own due diligence, know your client checks? Who would like to have a go at answering that?
I think that sounds like it's a question for me, picking up on one of the points I made towards the end.
Yeah.
I think probably the answer is no, at the risk of giving too short an answer. By way of a bit of explanation, the issue, I imagine, is going to be in showing a duty owed by the bank specifically to the victim of fraud, and that duty is then breached. A general KYC anti-money laundering obligation is an obligation that the bank owes as a matter of its regulatory requirements and not owed to the whole public, certainly not giving rise to a freestanding cause of action. I think if you're going to start trying to rely on poor KYC on the part of the bank, what I think you need to do is to start to link something that's gone wrong in the bank's regulatory obligations to the particular transactions that you're complaining about. So to give an example, if the bank allows a customer to open up an account which the customer says is only going to be used for low value transactions within England, no foreign currency, and it's used for that purpose, but then suddenly a very large US dollar sum comes in from abroad and is then sent out abroad. In those circumstances, that's the sort of novel case where there are a couple of attempts to fix banks with liabilities. But without that sort of trigger, really, you're not going to be able to just turn around and say you, the bank, didn't do effective KYC and allowed a fraudster to open up a bank account, and that they use that to facilitate fraud. That's not going to be enough to allow you to recover any sums from the bank. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Matt. Anyone else want to add to that?
I just wanted to add one further consideration, which is that in my experience, at least, the pattern of these frauds is very similar, which is that the initial payment may go into a single account, but it will then likely be distributed to a number of other accounts in relatively small parcels. And those accounts may be in the names of actually innocent third parties. I say innocent in advisedly. Third parties who are not directly involved with the fraud, but who agree in return for a sum of money to lend their bank accounts to strangers. I've seen it happen before. It seems extraordinary, but it happens. They get approached by someone on the street who says, "Can I borrow your bank account for a day, and in return you can have 500 quid?" And so what you find is that the fraud very quickly looks on its face to be relatively innocent. You have small parcels of money going into a number of different accounts with different banks. And it can be very hard to say that those transactions in and of themselves raise any particularly suspicious activity that banks should be aware of. So fraudsters are alive to these developing issues, and that does make it difficult to try and then fix the banks with responsibility for identifying problems.
Thank you, Thomas. Although I'm not sure that I would describe someone who lends their account to someone for a day for £500 as, quote, innocent.
So
anyway, that's another...
It's a relative term in that respect.
Let me go to another question asked by David Perfetto, who asks this. He says that he comes from a P&I broker company, PL Ferrari, and he's personally dealing with a case where our clients, owners, remitted money to whom they thought to be sub-agents in Brazil on the basis of a slightly amended email address. Agents who introduced the sub-agents to owners said that their IT system had not been hacked, and our clients can groundedly affirm the same. Police investigations in both countries, Italy and Brazil, did not reach any final conclusion as to whose system was hacked, and so each party is reluctant to accept responsibility. Amicable settlement is now being considered, but I wonder, asks David, which party you think should bear responsibility, considering that it is unclear where the fraud started from? Anyone want to go on that?
I think, oh, so I see Robert's died again, please.
Well, sorry, well, I come from the practical claims handling and underwriting side, is that, as I say, really for our end, it's the onus is on the party paying to do the checks. And it's, as Matthew's alluded to, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify the source of the hack because they're very good at covering their tracks. By the time it's realized, the email logs have been deleted. So in our view, and I'd like to hear Matthew's view on the sort of on the legal basis of this, it's the party making the payment really has to do the checks.
Yes, I think I generally agree, definitely with that final section, that really the paying party is the one who's got to be the most careful. Robert and I have had a sort of discussion of views on this before, and you start to get to a stage where there's almost a bit of a difference between commercial expectations and legal expectations. So here, David De Perfetto's message is referring to which party is at blame for the hack. But as I tried to explain in my session, actually approaching this from the legal perspective, I'd say that's very much the sort of further down the line type question. I'd be looking at saying, well, who's been tricked and did they effectively act as an agent when passing on the payment details? As I said, normally the answer to that is going to be no, and by the sounds of it, that may well be the case here. In which case, yes, it's the paying party, which is the one that is effectively stuck with the loss. It's going to be quite difficult to say actually the person who was in some way responsible for the fraud taking place by having poor cybersecurity, that because they had poor cybersecurity, they therefore are effectively liable for the cost of the fraud, whatever that may be, whenever that may happen. But that, I think, there's a bit of a gap here between how the law works, perhaps, and what is expected by the likes of Roberts and his team of responsible commercial actors making these checks and having proper systems in place.
Thank you, Matt. And any other contribution on that question from David? Okay, let me go to a third question from Catherine Martin. Do the panelists believe that the IMO's advice reincorporating cyber risk management into a vessel's ISM, safety management system, may become mandatory? is it likely to become an audited ISPS-style certification issue with cybersecurity assessments and cybersecurity plans being required per vessel? That's quite a technical question. Anyone up to answering it? Thomas, you've unmuted yourself. Are you going to?
I have. The short answer is I don't know, but I expect it will. As I mentioned in my talk, it's rather left to the flag states, and there's going to be a variety of approaches as to how it's implemented. But certainly from a legal perspective, I think any obligations of seaworthiness and due diligence in relation to seaworthiness are going to expect this sort of risk management to be a prerequisite to seaworthiness.
Well, as far as I understand, I mean, the MCA have issued a notice stating it's 12 months after the 1st of January, I think prior to the next DOC audit. So I was under the impression that it is becoming mandatory, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, all right. Now, Nicola Cox has got a second question, which is directed to you, Robert, so don't go away. What due diligence do you expect from Assures, for instance, about staff training and internal IT systems? And have your due diligence requirements changed or increased over recent years?
Well, we have a requirement under our rules that the members should have proper systems and controls. And obviously that changes from business to business. But we don't have any specific requirements, but we issue a lot of loss prevention advice. And what Nicola says is gets the nub of it, and its staff training is extremely important. So it only takes someone in the HR department to click on a link and open a CV up, and then you've got your North Korean hacking group inside your company. So the staff has to be trained about these sort of situations, and they need to be taught not to click on links, not to open attachments. So, for example, you can have phishing simulators where it will generate random phishing emails to be sent into the company to see who does click on the links. And it's not just to identify who does click on the link, it's also to identify which of the employees will report it into the IT department, because that's also very important to get feedback of when attacks are being made. So staff training is the essential part of it, yes.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to join in on that? All right. Could I ask a question of the panel? It's a slightly more general question, because I'm not an owner or a charterer or an agent or a sub-agent or an intermediary, but I do have transfers and payments to make, and sometimes I have to phone up the bank in order to make them. And what I'm struck by when I do that is that my bank won't accept any instructions by email. So I have to speak to them. And they have the precaution of having a voice recognition system. And so when I speak to the bank, they know that it's me speaking to them. But their precautions go still further than that, because I think to protect themselves rather than to protect me, but at any rate, perhaps to protect both of us, having taken my instructions, they then say, well, we are going to phone you back sometime later today to confirm your instructions before we carry them out. And then they do that. And on one occasion, I remember I was walking in the park during COVID time, taking my daily constitutional, and the phone went, and it appeared to be my bank. And I said to them, it wasn't my bank manager, it was someone I didn't recognize. And I said to them, well, I said, you say that you're my bank, but how do I know that? I haven't got a voice recognition system, and I'm not going to give you any information. You're asking for details from me and confirmation, and I'm not going to give you any information over the phone. So that put an end to that. How do you resolve that sort of cycle of ever decreasing circles? And how important is voice recognition going to be in fighting cybercrime?
Well, I think it's definitely technology is the way forward. I think the international payment system is pretty working on antiquated systems, so SWIFT payments, etc. And I would have thought payments can be modernized through the example of blockchain technology, so end-to-end encryption. But for your example of voice recognition, well, that can also be spoofed. You can have deep fake videos and also deep fake video calls, so voice calls. So it may not be that difficult to fake the voice of another person. So I'm not an expert in that way, but it's definitely a difficult subject.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much to the panelists. Jeremy, are you going to bring proceedings to a close, or is that my responsibility?
Well, I'm quite happy to do precisely that. It's always such a pleasure when we have such a good panel as we've had this evening. The centre has prided itself over its 26 years or so of existence that we've always maintained a very high standard, and I think that's been amply exemplified by the panel this evening. And so far as the people who are participating within the membership of people who want to hear what is happening, the last time I played any part, then I think I'm right in saying that we had 430 registered participants from 34 different countries. Now, I don't know what the records are this evening, but if we do have that number of people, I think they've been richly rewarded by what they've been able to listen to and hear this evening. I always like to thank the unknown heroes behind these seminars. We have 20 Essex Street for their organisation skills here. I think I have to particularly thank Andrew Dinsmore for coordinating the event, and of course Angelica Lamb for her IT skills. Next on the list, of course, there is the panel, and they have maintained the standards very, 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 very ably. I think they've all been terrific. It does actually make me feel glad in a way that I've retired from being a practicing lawyer when the difficulties are so immense. The poor old ship owner or people responsible for making payments, they really are having such a difficult time given the skills of those who perpetrate the frauds. Thank goodness we have the likes of Robert Hodge out there to keep an eye on them and trying to prevent them. But it does seem to me sometimes that the people who are perpetrating the frauds are one step ahead of the innocent people who suffer as a result. I would particularly like to thank you, Sir Bernard, for giving of your valuable time, and for doing so in such a warm way, which goes down so well and is so much appreciated. As you know, the centre certainly could not continue to exist without the assistance of those such as yourself who are prepared to come in on a as I think was described as a wet and rainy Monday evening. Thank you so much. Then I have to mention the next LSLC webinar that'll be to be held on Wednesday, the 16th of June, and the topic there is bill of lading disputes. But of course, finally, I always have to thank all those who've participated, whether they be in London, as we used to for our normal seminars, or those who are all around the world for the webinars. And I'd just like to thank everyone involved for their kind participation.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for those very kind words. I too would like to thank the panelists and all those who have joined our webinar and those who have asked questions. It's a great pleasure for me to help in this, and I always loved my shipping law above all other things, and it takes me back to those happy days. I hope you have a very good evening and a very good week wherever you are.